What are we gonna do now?
Do? We're gonna war. That's what we're gonna do.
Okay, guys, Professor Tatum here with yet another lecture for History 1301. As that sound bit at the beginning suggested, we're looking at all kinds of war today. Looking at some contests for power. We're going to be seeing conflicts between Indians and other Indians, Europeans and other Europeans, Europeans and Indians, and a big messy web of overlap everywhere in between. So here we'll be looking at a little bit of context as usual. Then we'll look at a big war for empires known as the 7 Years' War, even though it's actually 9 years long. Then we'll examine the treaty that ended this war, which was the Treaty of Paris 1763. Now, you guys know I never really carry no specific dates, but I'm going to make an exception here because there are over 20 treaties of Paris throughout world history, and this one in particular does something pretty specific. And in a few lectures moving forward, we're going to see another Treaty of Paris that's going to do something completely different. So we need to be able to distinguish between the two. And the only way to really do so is to use the years in which they were established. Okay, so we need to understand this Treaty of Paris of 1763 is different from the Treaty of Paris 1783 we'll be looking at later. Okay, let's get on into it. So throughout the colonial period, up into the mid 1700s, there had been a series of wars for empire between the various European nations who we've been watching colonize in the Americas. Now, these conflicts usually played out by having Britain go to war with France, who would usually be allied with Spain. Sometimes it get a little more complicated than that, but France and Spain, although they were colonial competitors, and did have some conflicts at certain points in time, managed to forge some kind of alliances through marriage and things like that. And there's also the motivation of France and Spain being predominantly Catholic nations, Britain being a predominantly Protestant nation. But the real driving conflict between these wars for empire usually was directly tied to mercantilism. Mercantilism, remember, is that economic theory that's based on two main points. One being the belief in a limited amount of resources and wealth. Two, the goal of creating a favorable balance of trade, meaning essentially you have control of the majority of resources and wealth to the point where you're exporting more than you're importing. You have other people depending more on you than you have to depend on them. And in order to obtain some of this limited wealth and start working toward that favorable balance of trade, we've seen each of these empires establishing colonies around the world. We've been focusing on them here in the Americas, but I suggested that they're doing so in other parts of the world as well. It's really their imperialism and establishing colonies that's driving these wars for empire. They're having disputes over territorial claims, as well as over who has control of what resources and what areas. And then, of course, there's just good old-fashioned political rivalries between various monarchs and all that jazz that plays into this as well. But just like with colonization, mercantilism is usually kind of the driving force to these wars for empire that were being fought throughout the colonial period up into the 1750s. Coinciding with these wars for empire were wars between European colonists and indigenous peoples, as European colonists were trying to grapple with indigenous power. Remember, they're constantly having conflicts and collisions with various indigenous nations. And we also need to understand that in many cases, indigenous peoples would take advantage of having these competing imperial powers in North America and would sometimes play them against each other to their advantage. We need to understand also that all European powers contested for power with indigenous peoples. So, for example, we saw the Beaver Wars, in which the French and the Dutch sided on either side with indigenous allies, all trying to fight for control of certain hunting grounds so that they could get certain furs for the fur trade. Also, the Spanish were frequently battling with groups like the Comanches and the Apaches, and we saw how, for example, the Apaches, in one case, played the Spanish against the Comanches by helping them build a mission just to let the Comanches see, hey, we've got an alliance with the Spanish. And sure enough, the Comanches got real upset about that and came and raided the Spanish, right? So there's an example of them playing the powers against each other. But while all these nations were grappling with indigenous power, it tended to be the English between the three major empires we've been looking at, the Spanish, the English, and the French. it was the English primarily who had the most conflicts with indigenous people, largely because they were invested in bringing the most people over. And as a result, they were interested in getting the most land. Remember, they're having people come over in large numbers, settling with their families, and doing extensive farming. By the way, I need to remind you guys before we move forward, in case it comes up, I will again be using the terms English and British interchangeably. Remember, it's somewhere in the early 1700s when England incorporates Scotland and other territories into their empire that they start referring to themselves as Great Britain. So really, before then, they're technically called English, but for the sake of simplicity, I don't care that you know all that. I may use those terms English and British interchangeably. Okay, but I can understand why the English were fighting the most with indigenous peoples. We can see their demands for land very clearly at play through a phenomenon known as the Great Migration in the 1630s. Now, this is a term that if you don't listen to what I'm saying here and you just go Google it, you're probably going to really embarrass yourself by writing about something on your exam that has nothing to do with anything we're talking about and took place way further along in history than anything we're looking at in our class here. Sad thing is, most people who need to hear that probably aren't even taking the time to watch this video, but I digress. So this Great Migration that we're looking at here refers to a migration of English colonists into North America throughout the 1630s. Several of them were Puritans coming here for religious reasons, but several people also had a lot of economic motivations for coming to the Americas. And as all these waves of English colonists are coming across to the Americas throughout the 1630s, with their families settling in large numbers, they're all going to want land to settle on. And some of them are going to want more and more land as they start establishing farms and plantations and things like that. And this is not just an unpopulated wilderness, as I keep saying over and over. There are indigenous peoples populating North America all over the place. And as these English colonists start coming in these large numbers and looking for more and more land, they're going to continuously encroach further and further into various nations of indigenous peoples' homelands, and that's going to lead to extensive conflict. Okay, so this great migration of the 1630s, which again is this mass migration of English colonists to North America, is pretty historically significant in the sense that it led to increased demands for land and in turn increased conflicts with indigenous peoples. All sounds like a very simplified ID term that I have just laid out for you, so you shouldn't have to Google anything for. Clear example we can see, though, of the contest for power between English colonists and Native Americans is the Pequot War, which you guys heard a first-hand account about from an English colonist who partook in the fighting. This war was based on tensions between English and Pequots over several issues. I could get all into them, but just briefly, there's a lot of disputes over trade, who's going to trade with who's going to control trade with certain groups of people, as well as competition for controlling communication and travel, which we looked at a little bit last lecture. But the climax of all these tensions came when some Pequots killed two English traders. And when they realized how upset the English were at them for killing these English traders, they said, "Oh, we're sorry. We thought those were Dutch traders. We didn't mean to kill any Englishmen. We thought they were Dutch. We didn't know any better until it was too late. Our mistake." Now, historians kind of debate whether or not that's true. Maybe they did think they were Dutch traders. Maybe they said that to try to save their own skin when they realized how mad the English were. Don't really know for sure. But what we do know is the English weren't taking that as an excuse, and they responded with all-out war. Right, so you guys saw the kinds of actions that the English took against the Pequots. You saw it was not just eye for an eye, killing a couple of Pequot men because a couple of Englishmen had been killed. You saw they were doing things like coming in and storming their villages and burning down their homes, burning down their cornfields, killing men, women, children, the elderly. We even saw that the English allied themselves with the Pequot's enemies, people like the Narragansett. And even the Pequot's enemies were appalled at the actions that the English were taking here. They couldn't believe that they would carry that out against any society of human beings, whether they were their enemies or not. And I think this all very clearly demonstrates to us some things about the Black Legend. The Black Legend, remember, was that propaganda used by Britain and other European nations to justify their colonization. It was basically based on this argument that Spain, who had first colonized North America, had treated Native Americans so poorly, so they had a duty to come in and colonize in a more civilized manner. Well, this kind of shows us that that was really just an excuse for them to come and colonize. Overall, it's a load of malarkey, right? Very clearly, they're not doing anything any more humane here if they're coming in and burning down people's food supplies and their homes and killing their children and grandparents, right? This war was so devastating that it led to the virtual extermination of Pequots, meaning just about everybody in their society was either killed or enslaved and shipped off to the Caribbean, where they were forced to do harsh labor on the plantations down there. And we've already seen in a previous lecture just how harsh conditions were for enslaved people in the Caribbean. So overall, very shortly after this, vast majority of Pequots died off and were unable to sustain themselves as a nation. But the Pequot War and similar conflicts between English and Native Americans early on had impacts on Native American warfare as well. So we need to understand that the traditional method of warfare for many Native American groups, including those in this region here, was that their warfare was more related to demonstrations of power. Okay, so two sides would kind of face off with each other, and certain brave warriors would get up into the other enemy group and they'd maybe touch them with their weapons, and there'd be a little maybe arrow fired back and forth, and a few people would be killed, but it was mainly a display of power. And eventually, one side would say, "Hey, dude, you're clearly the biggest badass here. What can we do to submit to what you'd like here?" All right, and they'd kind of end the war with as few casualties as possible. Far different than the English coming in, killing men, women, children, elderly, and burning things down. Right. So people realized that if they were going to survive as these Europeans were colonizing, they were going to have to heavily adapt their methods of warfare. And we see that come into play here with another conflict between the English colonists and Native Americans, which was called King Philip's War, also known as Metacom's War. So with Metacom's War, there had been some tensions growing between the English colonists and Native Americans in New England as England tried to assert dominance in the region. Again, this had a lot to do with things like undermining indigenous control of travel and communication. But one major step that the English took here was that they tried to order all indigenous peoples in New England to surrender their weapons. And we've seen in the 21st century how frustrated some people can get with the mere idea that somebody might want to take away their guns, right? People will lose their over that. And very much so, we saw that happen here. There was a large resistance movement led by a Wampanoag chief named Metacom, who the English called King Philip because they said he dressed like a European. And Metacom led this very brutal campaign against the English colonies. He went around destroying about a third of the English settlements in New England, and he killed somewhere around 1,000 colonists. So this is very clearly a destructive war. This isn't any demonstration of power like had traditionally been fought here by Native Americans in New England. King Philip's War was clearly a demonstration about the impacts of English colonization on Native American warfare. Okay, we can see here a very clear demonstration that English colonization has led to much more violent forms of warfare practiced by Native Americans, right? By the way, though, I did want to make note of some other things that happened here throughout this war. The English did manage to eventually regain the upper hand, and they retaliated against Metacom and his followers. They wound up capturing Metacom. They beheaded him, and they placed his head on a pike. And they left that pike that had his head on it on display outside of their colony in Plymouth for over 20 years. This served as a symbol to all other indigenous peoples in the region of what might happen to them if they tried to resist the English as they tried to assert their dominance in the area. Again, here, this very clearly demonstrates communication as a form of power, right? They're communicating to nearby indigenous peoples that they have taken control of certain things here, and if they're resisted, this is what might happen to them. All right, so we've seen clearly some wars for empire overlapping with conflicts with indigenous peoples and contests for power in that regard. And all these things culminated into a war known as the 7 Years' War. Actually lasted 9 years, not 7. And that's because it was fought for 2 years here in North America before it was fought anywhere else. It did end up becoming a global conflict all around the world between various European powers and their allies. But the fighting actually started here in the North American theater, which is referred to as the French and Indian War. The real basis of this war was a competition between British colonists and French colonists over this territory known as the Ohio River Valley. They both wanted control of this region. The French had some claims here. The British didn't really recognize those claims. They wanted to expand out into that region, largely because there was a lot of very valuable resources here, and there were also a lot of animals here who could be hunted and would be very profitable for the fur trade. There was already some existing fur trade here as well, practiced by indigenous peoples in the region who they wanted to kind of partner with to tap into that fur trade. So there were several groups of indigenous people already living here by the time the French and British started competing over who was going to control this territory. Many had been there for generations. So, for example, some of the people who had participated with the French in forging the middle ground were living in this area here. These included groups like Algonquian peoples and the Hurons. There were also several people who had gradually come here more recently in the years leading up to the French and Indian Wars. Many of these were individuals whose nations or bands had been negatively impacted by either warfare with other Native Americans or by European colonialism. And they had found that their nations were in very weakened states. So there were individuals who would come here from all different Indian groups from all around the area, and they would work together to create these kind of intertribal confederacies or nations, which Europeans kind of derogatorily referred to as republics. As colonists representing monarchies, they didn't have a whole lot of respect for the idea of republicanism. So, yes, this was very much meant to be an insult to refer to these intertribal groups as republics. So the British certainly had motivation to get here. Again, they wanted to tap into the fur trade, which was thriving in the region. And of course, the British, being the British and all their settlers they're bringing in, and all the farming they're practicing, wanted access to more land. The French also wanted to continue the fur trade. They'd been engaged in it for quite some time. They had interest also here in maintaining their alliances that were part of the middle ground, but they also wanted to stall British expansion. Remember, they're out fighting wars for empire against each other. They're colonial competitors, and the French don't want to see the British get more powerful by claiming more territory, especially this very valuable territory with resources that they want to maintain and peoples who they want to maintain alliances with. And a lot of these Indians in the region here took advantage of this. They knew that the French and the British both wanted access to this land, and they started kind of pitting them against each other and using this to their advantage. So, for example, if there was anything that the British were not willing to trade with Native Americans, maybe something like guns or alcohol, they'd say, okay, we'll just go over here and get it from the French then. See you later. And the British would say, no, 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 come on, come back. How can we work this out? Or vice versa. If they were trying to trade something with the French, but the French weren't giving them as much of whatever they wanted, they said, you know what? I think maybe we can get a better deal over here with the British. So we'll head over that way. And the French would say, okay, 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 I can give you whatever it is you want here. Don't go over the British. And this was working to their advantage for quite some time. But things really escalated for everybody involved when the governor of Virginia here in the British colonies granted a big grant of about 500,000 acres of land to British colonists in this region. Problems with this again. The French already had claims here, and there's also all these indigenous peoples already settled here. The French were really not happy about this, and to try to prevent these British colonists from flocking out into this region that the governor had promised them, they started building forts all along the region and manning them with soldiers. So the British sent a young officer, a lieutenant colonel named George Washington, to come in and pressure the French out, basically to give them an ultimatum that they needed to leave. This was very clearly an effort for the British to try to establish their dominance, showing the French, we call the shots here. And the French didn't just back down like the British hoped they would. So George Washington and his troops fired on the French soldiers who they had encountered. This here was the start of this French and Indian War, which would grow into the global 7 Years' War. I think this meme here very clearly demonstrates what's going on here. The British are coming in trying to take this territory for themselves, And the French, who think they have claims to the region, are saying, you're trying to kidnap what I've rightfully stolen. And what they've stolen, of course, here is Native American lands. This, by the way, is from The Princess Bride. If you've never seen that movie, go watch it. It is hilarious. I grew up watching this movie on repeat. All right, so pretty quickly, once the war started, Spain came and allied with France. Not a big surprise there. We saw that throughout the wars for empire, they were usually allies. Spain also, of course, was a big colonial competitor with Britain. And there were also various Indian nations who ended up joining either side here. Okay, so for example, the Iroquois Confederacy up in the Northeast Woodlands joined with the British because they had a long-standing set of agreements with the British, referred to as the Covenant Chain. The Covenant Chain had perhaps been fractured somewhat by this point, but by joining the British in the war against the French and their indigenous allies, the Iroquois kind of demonstrated a restoration of that Covenant Chain. But the Huron or Wyandot Nation, as well as various Algonquian nations who had been long engaged in the French with alliances that they had forged throughout the Middle Ground, came to their assistance here. These are just some examples, by the way. There were several groups of indigenous peoples involved in this conflict. And we need to keep in mind that they also had their own interests on either side. There's also very real political struggles between the various indigenous nations that are encouraging them to get involved with this conflict. But at the beginning of this war, something very fascinating happened that we certainly need to be mindful of. And that was with Benjamin Franklin, who was an intellectual, who was highly revered in the British colonies, created what was known as the Albany Plan for Union. He reinforced his basic plan here with this political cartoon, which he titled Join or Die. And this really sums up what his plan was all about. So you see here this snake that's made up of various parts, and each of these parts resembles different British colonies in North America. So you have here the New England colonies, then over here you have the Carolinas, you got New York, New Jersey. All right, these are all different British colonies, suggesting that alone they're nothing more than little useless pieces. But if they could all come together and work as a united body, they could have the strength of this great serpent who could strike at the French. And he's basically telling them, guys, we need to stand together. That's what his plan of union is all about. He says we need to stand as a union of colonies, work together, bring our militias under one common force, and have them work together to defeat the French. He's basically saying if we do this, we don't have to depend on mom and dad to come over from Britain and back us up. We can take care of ourselves if we can all work together. And those of you who are trying not to fall asleep as you listen to this, you're missing that this is, in a sense, the first kind of idea of any kind of colonial unity. This is the first time that there'd be anything close to what would develop as the United States. So this is pretty significant in the sense that it is the first major call for colonial unity, okay? And it planted those ideas of colonial unity in the minds of colonists, right? So they did wind up rejecting this idea. They didn't go through with it, but it would definitely lead to continued calls for colonial unity moving forward and continued envisionment of the colonies being able to stand as a united body. This is crucial to the development of what we call the United States. Right? So I try not to get too lost in what we call Whig history, in which we know what's going to happen next. So we try to find evidence of how it's going to lead up to the next moment when we study a certain topic. But it's really hard not to do as we examine this period here. A lot of what happens throughout this war, and definitely in the aftermath, certainly seems to set the stage for the American Revolution in so many ways. All right, and this is definitely one of them here. Okay, so very, very quick overview of what's going on here with the fighting. I think I've made it clear before. If not, here it is. I'm not really a military historian. That's not my forte. While I appreciate military history for what it is, it's not something I get too into. So I don't get caught up in naming all the commanders and understanding all their battle tactics and the numbers of everybody involved and blah, 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 or the types of weapons they're using and all that jazz. I focus more on the causes, effects, human experience, big picture stuff, kind of trying to fit this all into the broader historical narrative we're looking at here. So let me give you my very extensive overview of the fighting. I say very sarcastically. So early in the war, things weren't going great for Britain. There were a lot of defeats, surrenders, and retreats. George Washington, for example, gets a lot of pushback by historians throughout his time as a military commander for frequently using retreats rather than facing head on in battle. I'll take it to my grave, though, that George Washington was a great leader. He certainly knew how to boost the morale of his men and guide them to victories. And I'll certainly argue that sometimes a retreat is the best option. If it means sparing the lives of several of the people under you and being able to fight another day and helping create a better chance of victory long term, that's going to be a lot more beneficial than trying to be a big badass and fighting even when all the odds are stacked against you just to show off what a badass you think you are and getting everybody killed and setting everybody back in the long term. Anyway, I digress. The British weren't doing so great early on, but then the British installed this guy, William Pitt, as essentially their new war minister in England. Parliament basically gave him a blank check to do whatever he wanted with this war, and he did not take that lightly. All right, he started sending over some more capable commanders, some better trained soldiers, and he started sending some naval fleets to come take out the French fleets here. And by doing all these things, he was able to turn the war into Britain's favor, and eventually Britain was able to pressure France to surrender. Of course, Spain was France's ally, so now they were going to have to be kind of given up on this war here as well. So the war's ended. Representatives from Britain, France, and Spain all held peace talks in Paris. Again, this is 1763. I usually try my best to make sure y'all don't have to know dates, but this is one we do need to know so we don't mix it up with 1783, a little down the road here. But this Treaty of Paris of 1763 would set the term for the war's end. But one thing laid out very clearly by this Treaty of Paris of 1763 was there were new territorial claims in North America. Right? So the French were essentially kicked out of North America. Their former territory was divided between the British and the Spanish. So the Spanish were essentially given this western half of the French territory, basically as a thank you from France for their participation in the war. And then England, as the victors of the war, really got all this other stuff here. And some of you may be wondering, what the hell, if Spain was allied with France, who lost the war, why are they getting so much here? Well, because in exchange for that, let's take a look what Britain got from Spain. Look over here, before the war, Spain had Florida, a very, very valuable coastal colony, and now they ceded that over to Britain. So pretty much in exchange for allowing Britain to have Florida, Britain allows Spain to have the western half of this territory here. There's also kind of this unspoken understanding here between Britain and France that by this point, Spain was kind of weaker. They'd kind of lost a lot of their power by this point, and they kind of both understood, Britain and France, that if they ever really wanted to, one of them could very easily probably come in and force Spain out of here and take this territory for themselves. But for now, this at least ended the fighting at the moment, let them move on with their lives. But this new division of power between European peoples would have all kinds of impacts on other peoples as well. For example, enslaved people in a lot of these colonies here in the southern British colonies, down in the Chesapeake in the lower south, were now surrounded by British enslavers. They had nowhere they could run to. Now, remember, before the war, Spanish Florida was welcoming enslaved people and granting them freedom. Now, with the buffer colony in Georgia, that was pretty difficult to do, but it was still a possibility. So there's still that kind of shining light of hope, if nothing more than a dream to most enslaved people, that maybe they could escape down to Spanish Florida and seek freedom. Now, after the 7 Years' War, that was no longer an option, okay? Britain had them all surrounded here. We also need to consider who is not included here. I see territory for the Spanish, for the British. The French, remember, basically got kicked out of North America. They do still have some influence here in the Caribbean, and they have some fisheries. But what about where are all these other groups who fought in the war? Remember, we saw nations like the Wyandot. We saw Algonquian nations, the Iroquois Confederacy, which is made up of 6 nations by this point. Where are all their land claims? They were not included, okay? They were not even invited to the peace talks, even though they participated very heavily in the war. A lot of this war was driven by them and their politics. And this Treaty of Paris of 1763 and these divisions, which left them out, certainly had all kinds of ramifications for various groups of indigenous peoples. As you guys heard in the part of the podcast that you listened to here, this Treaty of Paris of 1763 had conflicting impacts on different groups of indigenous peoples. For example, Cherokees, the Creeks, people living down in this southeastern region here, they faced a similar experience to enslaved people in the sense that before the war, they had profited by having the French over here and other Indian republics, and then having the Spanish down here. They could kind of trade with all of these people here and benefit from them. Also, in some cases, remember, they could pressure them by tempting them that they were going to go to the other to get what they wanted. Now, after the war, that was no longer an option because they're just surrounded by the British. And the British, as we've seen, they're less dependent on alliances with indigenous peoples because they're here in much larger numbers. They're also more willing to kick indigenous peoples out of their homelands because they want access to more and more land. So for the Creeks, the Cherokees, and groups, the Seminoles, groups like that living in this region here, things didn't turn out so well as a result of the Treaty of Paris of 1763. By contrast, you guys learned of the Osage. They lived here along the Mississippi River Valley, right on the border of what was now Spanish territory and British territory. So the Spanish, as I suggested before, were weaker at this point in time. So they weren't able to really have a whole lot of settlement in this territory they'd acquired. They had a few forts stationed here and there, a few settlements here and there. In those sparsely populated forts and settlements, were in dire need of supplies at certain points in time. And so groups like the Osage would come in and trade with them and provide them the things that they needed. And they could basically set the conditions however they wanted for the trade because the people here were so dependent on it. There were even some cases recorded where the Osage would show up in one fort, maybe one Spanish fort, and it'd be very obvious that the goods they were providing them in trade had been raided from a Spanish settlement somewhere down the way, and they just kind of turned a blind eye to it, maybe practice a little salutary neglect there, and engage in the trade regardless because they were so desperate, not only for good relations with the Osage, but also for whatever material goods they were bringing. Imagine that's like maybe being so desperate that somebody comes to you and they say they want to sell you a lawnmower, and you recognize your brother-in-law's lawnmower that just happened to go missing from his garage recently, but you really need to cut your grass so bad that you're just going to kind of say, okay, here's $20. So definitely conflicting impacts on indigenous peoples here, but they all were certainly impacted, yet not taken seriously by the European colonizers who are now making all these claims all over North America without considering the various polities of indigenous peoples here. And a lot of these disagreements based around the new territorial divisions by European empires led to a series of campaigns led by an Ottawa chief named Pontiac that became known as Pontiac's War. So Pontiac, you guys have read some sources from. He was very heavily inspired by the Native American prophet Neolin, and he and Neolin both promoted this idea of pan-Indianism, meaning having all indigenous peoples, regardless of whether they were Iroquois or Algonquian or whatever, to come together as a unified type of people, right? They had that kind of shared common experience of being the antithesis of their European colonizers, and they needed to collectively resist their European colonizers. They also called, of course, for a return to traditional indigenous customs and a break from European customs that they had come to adopt. And Pontiac and his followers led a series of assaults on British forts and surrounding settlements that were very devastating to the British people. And the King of England, King George III, tried to ease the hostilities from Pontiac's war. Kind of saw Pontiac's war or Pontiac's rebellion, as it's very arrogantly referred to by the British, as a wake-up call. Right? He realized that there needed to be some limitations on British settlement, or there's going to continue to be these kinds of skirmishes between Native Americans and British, as Native Americans were getting increasingly upset with the British pushing further and further and further into their homelands. So King George came up with a solution to ease hostilities with indigenous peoples by drawing this proclamation line of 1763 to limit how far the British could settle into the continent. Essentially, he drew this line along the Appalachian Mountains which are right about here on this map. This red line here, that's the proclamation line. Those are the Appalachian Mountains. And he said that colonists could only settle east of that line and that all territory west was free for indigenous peoples to live on. Now, he can say this all he wants, but he's all the way over in England, and colonists aren't going to care so much. This is kind of like putting a line of tape in the middle of some room with some kids in it and telling them, you stay on your side of the line, you stay on yours. They're going to, the second you walk out the door, find ways to start sneaking across each other's side of the line and antagonizing each other, right? Exactly what happened here. Okay, there were continued raids from indigenous peoples and continued encroachment into indigenous peoples' lands by the colonists. We need to understand that all kinds of things came at play here that impacted the relations between the colonists and the British government. So this was a very expensive war just fought, this 7 Years' War. And in order to pay off the debts that were accrued throughout this war, the British were going to need to come up with some new sources of revenue. We also need to consider the fact that as a result of this war, the French are no longer in North America. And so we need to remember that up to this point, up to the start of this war, the British had been practicing this policy, which was called salutary neglect. Remember, I described salutary neglect as essentially turning a blind eye to violation of smaller laws, especially to not paying some taxes here and there. Remember, they were afraid that if they were too harsh on the colonists and made too heavy of demands to make them pay all their taxes, that they might start turning to the French, right, and start supporting the French rather than the British Empire. So they practiced that policy of salutary neglect as a means of appeasement to the colonists. Well, now that the French were out of North America, and now that they had all these expensive war debts they had to pay off, they stopped this practice of salutary neglect. Right? They now started not only cracking down a little more firmly on colonists who were violating the law, but they certainly started making people pay their taxes. And they also started implementing some new taxes throughout the colonies that the colonists were very unfond of. And as we'll see moving forward, this proclamation line, the end of salutary neglect, and the new taxes that would be established here to help pay off the war debts were all seen as threats to the colonial habit of self-rule. And they would all lead to significant tensions between the British colonists and the British government. This is essentially here the seeds, which would eventually, very gradually, mind you, develop into the rebellion, which would very gradually develop into a revolution and an independence movement. So if you saw any of these terms pop up as ID terms, this here, the reason I've underlined this, spelled it out for you is because this is what I want to see. So don't try to think of some random thing or just Google something random and put whatever. I'm giving you the answer here. Use it. All right, guys, that's it for now. We covered a lot here. I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up here. If you got any questions, please let me know. Otherwise, that is it for now. Over and out.